Okay, we are back. We're going to talk about the first three episodes of the first season of Homicide: Life on the Street. This show was created in 1993 by Paul Attanasio, based off of a book, Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets by David Simon. Perhaps you know that name from various other projects.
Mhm.
Again, this show was given the pilot was given the post Super Bowl spot on January 31st, 1993. The first season consists of nine episodes. The first season, particularly the first three episodes, follows a group of detectives working in Baltimore Police Department's homicide division. This veteran group of detectives and their captain welcome a rookie homicide detective named Tim Bayless to the squad. They give him a high-profile murder case, a little girl named Medina Watson. This is his first job, and he is tasked with trying to solve it. Other cases throughout these episodes appear from time to time, including a cold case about a woman run over by a car, wife murdering her husband to collect insurance, an elderly woman who is not happy in her marriage and does nothing to stop her husband from dying a couple of times. So again, this is a homicide procedural show that has some cases that come and go throughout the episodes, and then one that seemingly is going to span most of the first season. This case of Adina Watson. Again, a show that ran from 1993 to 1999. How did you view it? How did you find it compared to the 2024 TV landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really interesting. So start with some thoughts about the structure and the pacing of the show, how it feels, knowing that it's from 1993. Um, I immediately started to see why people point to this as significant in the history of television. I'm old enough to remember 1993, even if I was
Right.
only 12 or 13 years old when this premiered. And I didn't watch it at the time. You didn't either, as I understand it. But we can remember the 90s, even if we were primarily, teenagers,
Hmm.
and what TV was like, and the pacing, I think, first of all, is very, I guess I'll just say modern. It didn't
Yeah.
feel like you go back to some things, even things that I quite enjoy. You go back to like the original Star Trek, for example, and you can feel how it's got this pace,
Yeah.
where it was made in the 1960s or what have you, or Hill Street Blues, which
Yes.
it just feels slower as it develops. And this is kind of quick and it flows, and the dialogue is choppy and witty, and um, I've enjoyed watching it so far. What about you?
Yeah. I frankly have loved it through the first few episodes. I think about it in terms of sort of that context you were saying. What I remember from that time frame, what I remember about shows like Hill Street Blues, St. Elsewhere, Law and Order premiered September of 1990, and even that show was in the same vein, but a case of the week. Sometimes
Mhm.
if we don't have enough, we got to sort of kind of fill time with stuff so that we can make sure that we time it to exactly 42 minutes. The show cares nothing about that. They want to tell a story, whatever time it takes, whatever we need that's interesting to fill it. I found myself being sort of compelled by maybe even more so the dialogue and the interpersonal relationships between the detectives, even more so than the cases that they're working on, because they've spent time with that, which is interesting. It's something you'd see today, maybe not so much back in the 90s.
Right, indeed. I think Law and Order is an interesting contrast, right? In a couple of ways. One of them is just what you're saying,
Hmm.
that Law and Order is very much a case of the week show. And I wouldn't say there's no characterization, like you get to know Lenny Briscoe and things like
Right.
that, but like not really. You don't see him at home.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we don't really get into um the personal lives of the characters on Law and Order. Indeed,
Would you ever have a three-episode arc of Law and Order where one of the detectives is agonizing about whether or not to ask the medical examiner on a date? Right. I mean, that's just
right, no, right.
not
You're
something
just
yeah.
indeed. I mean, I do recall later on. I recall a couple times in Law and Order where they kind of did something like this, and it felt like they were shoehorning something in. Um, so I don't know. I haven't kept up with Law and Order. Maybe they started doing more of this stuff. But we're back to 1993, right?
Yep.
The other thing is, if you watch Law and Order, it like so many other shows, particularly in this period, that you could point to that are in a similar kind of genre, like I don't know, Murder She Wrote, Matlock,
Yeah.
Diagnosis Murder, whatever. It's like pick your murder mystery show. What was the one with there's one with the priest. There are all kinds of, shows like this. My grandma used to watch all of them myself. Father
Yeah.
Dowling.
Oh, wow.
Um, they wrap it up
Yeah.
in one episode, right?
Yep.
So particularly Law and Order, the standard structure of Law and Order is it opens with a murder. Lenny Briscoe makes a quip. Dun dun. By the
Hmm.
end of the episode, it's been resolved, and like fundamentally nothing carries over.
Right. 2/3 of the way through the episode, the police are going to hand it off to the lawyers, the district attorney's office. They're going to try the case, and there's going to be an outcome. See you next week. I mean, you know exactly the formula.
Right. And like sometimes even maybe on Law and Order, sometimes they don't get a conviction, or
Right.
sometimes you might not be entirely sure the person they arrested actually did it, but it's resolved, it's over, we move on, right? And one of the things I thought was really interesting is about Homicide is it's not like that, but in the first episode it kind of is. It's not till the
Mm.
second episode that you get the introduction of the Adina Watson case.
Yes.
And it's almost a surprise that you don't get resolution as that episode ends with Bayless at her funeral, and so on. And then now it's sort of at that point becoming clearer that this show is going to be more. It's still an episodic show, but it's more it's serial episodic, I believe would be the term, right? Like,
Yeah.
and you
And I
start
do
seeing,
think that there are some elements of episode one that are going to, having watched that a little bit, are going to resurface in episodes 4, 5, and 6, and are unrelated to the Adina Watson case. So they're not afraid to sort of go back and revisit, touch on these things, assume you've paid attention, assume you've been following along, and we can reference these things without sort of sacrificing what we're trying to do here with the show.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's a really interesting forum. I actually really love the forum, which really had its heyday, I think, in the mid to late 90s. Maybe
Hmm.
starting here. Um, Twin Peaks was before this, but Twin Peaks is not really episodic. Because
Yeah.
what I mean, to be clear, if it's not clear to people by when I say serial episodic, is a show that's structured such that you don't need to have seen every episode. You can just pop in and watch one episode of the
Exactly.
show any given week. You've got enough information to enjoy that episode entirely on its own. But then there are some running storylines.
Yeah.
There are through lines. There are connections. But even if you watch the show somewhat irregularly, you can pick up on those enough,
Yes.
right, to not have to see every episode necessarily.
They
But if you
want you
are
to be able
seeing
to
every
join at
episode,
any
there's
time.
stuff
Yeah.
there to work with.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Exactly.
So Twin Peaks wasn't like that because you have to see every episode, right? Um, but other shows, I'm thinking primarily of ones that come a little bit later. Star Trek: The Next Generation was right around
Hmm.
this time, but didn't really start doing that stuff until a bit later. Deep Space Nine is probably the more exemplary Star Trek on the kind of serial episodic front. Shows
Yeah.
like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Um,
Yeah. We
I
moved
don't know
from,
what else.
say Buffy to Alias to Lost, and then we're off on you've got to be in from day one on these types of shows.
Yeah, I think by the time you get to Lost, you've got to be there from the beginning. You've
Yeah.
got you sort of have. It's not. It's more of a straight serial, as it were. You have to see every episode.
Yeah.
And in my mind, the way I think about TV history, I feel like that meaningfully started with shows like The Sopranos, which I
Yeah.
think started in 1999. Of course, there were some shows on HBO that were already doing that.
Yeah.
It's not TV, it's HBO. But
Yeah.
after The Sopranos, it seemed like, okay, well, now this is the thing that everyone wants to mimic, you
Yeah.
know? And I think part of what enabled that was DVDs
Yes.
and then streaming, but DVDs first, because
Yeah.
apologies if this is like too much of a technical tangent. DVDs
Well,
are actually really cheap to make in comparison to VHS tapes.
and the model where people all forget the Netflix model of just send me a bunch of DVDs. Anytime that you can watch a show and just press next episode, and you don't have to wait to next week, next month. after the summer hiatus. Anytime you can start to do that, then our sort of attention is going towards we need to have this sort of model. I was reading, listening to some stuff, other people talking about this show. Um, Credit to another podcast called The Watch, and they were talking about I mean this specific issue itself, and they brought up a show called Murder One, which came out in the 90s, which I'd forgotten about. But the premise
Mhm.
was we're going to follow one murder case through the whole season, and like how innovative that was. In 2024, that's every show, right? And that,
Right.
presumed innocent, all these things that just come, that's everything, right? So
Yeah.
this was sort of the blurring of the lines, homicide, life of the street, going from one to the other.
Yeah, and so it's also interesting, based on a book by David Simon.
Yes.
Um, I know people are familiar with David Simon, the creator of The Wire, for example. Um, Also a writer
Hmm.
on this show, not
Yes.
the head writer or anything, he's just a staff writer, but it's based on the book he wrote as a journalist, right?
Yep.
So this is like a nonfiction book, right?
Exactly.
David Simon kind of embedding himself with the police in Baltimore and writing this book, Homicide, a Year on the Killing Streets. And then apparently, my understanding is he approached Barry Levinson, whatever the details are, about the idea of adapting into a film. Barry
Yes.
Levinson said this would be better as a TV series, and
Right.
then, dominoes fall, and we end up with Homicide: Life on the Streets. David Simon is involved, um, consulting, producing, becomes a staff writer, and so on. And then, you know, not too long after this show ends, makes The Wire. I mean, I don't remember what year The Wire started, but it was
Yeah, I don't recall what
early
year it
aughts,
started, but yeah, it was. I mean, The Wire obviously
2000.
famously, about Baltimore and crime and sort of that same world. So certainly something that David Simon is familiar with. But you're right, it all started with this book that I think it was published in 1991, and then we've got 15 years of his sort of content off of this that begin from that.
Yeah, and there are connections between The Wire and this book that he wrote. Also, you can look in the details if you're curious about such things. We've got at least one main character in Homicide: Life on the Street who shows up in The Wire. This would be
Yep. Yep.
the actor Clark Johnson. Um, I think he's only in season 5 of The Wire.
Oh yeah, that may be true. I've not, as you know, I've not seen all of The Wire yet, so
Right.
comment on the later seasons, but
Tisk.
I do know there was some bleeding over, and it wasn't the only case of some bleeding over between the show and other properties in the future, right?
Oh yeah, you want to talk about Monk?
Yeah, why
So
not?
is this the same Monk who's in Law and Order SVU? Wikipedia says yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of I think verification that his role here I think flows into the Law and Order SVU munch that we see, and then he's also appeared in other sort of sporadic episodes of different shows that existed on different properties that managed by some of these creators, producers, writers.
Yeah, like he pops up in The Wire, pops
Hmm.
up in an episode of the X-Files,
Yeah.
pops up on I didn't copy the whole list. There's like a couple animated series where he's playing a detective month.
Yeah.
That strains continuity for sure. And that's still kind of the question I have a little bit, where it's really kind of interesting to me that Richard Belzer, he's just spending his whole career playing this one
Yeah.
character.
He was a comedian and
Oh
then
yeah,
took this role
a
and
pretty
has
good
been in
one.
this role for now 33 years.
Yeah. And I think he died relatively recently, didn't he, Richard
Oh, did
Belzer?
he? I did not realize that.
I meant to double check this before we got on the air. Apologies. I'll do it now.
Oh
Um,
yeah, February 2023. Yep.
yeah. R.I.P. man. The legend, 78 years old. But yeah, this plays Detective John Munch. It's still, what I was going to say is it's still a little bit of a question in my mind of, well, does all the narrative continuity really match up? I have the feeling that maybe they didn't care too much about
Yeah.
that.
People just liked his
Um,
character, so they wanted him everywhere.
yeah, but probably, and I don't recall this, but probably when he shows up in Law and Order, they make some mention about how he used to work in Baltimore. Probably,
Baltimore. Yeah, exactly.
probably. And that's kind of interesting to think about. If we do consider the character of John Munch in that vein, we here see a younger and perhaps more vulnerable version of
Yeah.
our who later becomes a very hard, cynical detective.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's something I wanted to talk about, which was I saw a reviewer describe these detectives as sort of something that embody, I think his quote was bleak realism. This idea that we often depict detectives as, the gumshoe, the hero, the guy who figures it out, the guy who saves the day, all this stuff. This is a very much, at least through 3 or 4 episodes, very much a I don't not a nihilistic look at sort of what's happening in their world, but it's not all going to turn out great at the end, right?
Yeah.
And it's just interesting and refreshing to see. I think it's more common today, but it probably was very refreshing to see something like that back in the 90s when it was all a hero's journey story from start to finish.
Oh no, absolutely. And I read something where David Simon even said about his book that his goal involved that kind of
Yeah,
de-romanticizing or their demythologizing
yeah,
of police detectives, where you have all these stories where it's um, Rockford Files, or I mean,
yeah,
actually that one's a little bit dark, but anyway, even if there's darkness,
yeah,
to the character, it's still like the detective is this heroic figure who
yeah.
solves every murder, and like
They're not Dick Tracy everywhere. That's the
right, like you don't end up with like episodes of Magnum PI where he doesn't figure it out,
right,
you know.
right.
And so I do think going back to the history of television, there's a significant shift. Like
Hmm.
you could really argue and maybe be correct. This is the first show that did this.
Yeah,
Um, and it's not that the part of I think is interesting is that it's not unsympathetic to the police detectives,
right,
and it's also not like the cops are anti-heroes or something. This isn't like the
right.
Shield,
Yeah.
for example.
There are not morality lines being blurred yet that we've
Yeah,
seen.
maybe there will be later, but it feels like bleak realism, sure, but it feels like the attempt is to get at a kind a realistic kind of portrayal
Yes, very
of
much so.
what it's like working as a homicide detective, which ultimately does bring with it a certain desensitization to death, to murder. It's just
Yeah,
happening all the time. It's your job. You see it, you know. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting on that front for sure.
yeah, I do too. I think that as much as they focus on sort of the balance between the cases and the reaction of the detectives to the cases, there's just sense of, yeah, this is it's almost trite to say, but yeah, this is my job, and this, as you comment on, this is what I see every day. This is what I do every day. Um, we'll talk a little bit about episode 3 in a bit, which is like, well, we're here and no one's called in a murder, so guess it's kind of a boring day on the job. It's just a sense of it's just something we do, and not a glorification of any of that.
Right. And then the entry point is a little bit of the trope, as it were, of the rookie detective coming to join the unit,
Hmm.
and yeah, I think that's working, but
Yeah,
that you do get that dynamic. There is a certain extent where it seems like Bayless does want to be the hero detective who gets justice for the young girl and solves every
yeah,
murder. And in the background is the reality of the fact that you have that board, for example,
hmm,
which I was reading was a real thing. And
yeah,
then because of the show, the Baltimore PD stopped using the board because they thought it was like bad PR. And then more time went on, and the detectives made them bring it back because they missed it. That was kind of funny. Like, well, we used the board. The board's useful,
yeah, really,
but symbolically, if you look at the board, it's color coded. You know,
yes,
well, what cases are closed, what's resolved, what have we solved, what haven't we solved, and a lot of unsolved cases.
yeah, yeah.
And that's the reality of it.
It is a reality, and yeah, just as a show that tried to portray reality, does that, and I think in a maybe too well, and that it made them get rid of that mechanism they were using. That's an interesting story.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I was thinking about how it's like, man, are there really this many murders in
Yeah.
Baltimore? And it is maybe worth noting as a brief aside that the murder rate has gone down over the past
Yes.
30 years, broadly speaking. Um, including in places like Baltimore and in New York
Hmm.
City. And um, anyhow, a lot of murders. But
Yeah.
again, it's based on David Simon's book. You look at the number of
Yeah.
murders
Well, we'd
that
be
occurred when he was on the beat.
we'd be remiss if we didn't say something about. So this was meant to be and is a very strong ensemble cast, but pretty quickly, Andre Brower as Detective Frank Pimbleton sort of rose above the rest. I mean, by the first few episodes, you can tell. I mean, this guy is throwing a million miles an hour and is just absolutely, just stands above this group and really became Andre Brower's breakthrough performance. Again, another one who recently passed.
Yeah,
But he's just fantastic in this show.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And his character Pembleton is, I mean, Pembleton is sort of set up that way, but then um, Andre Brower's performance lives up to the hype,
Yes.
basically, and maybe exceeds it. Yeah, he's great. I enjoyed how in episode 3 the lieutenant keeps telling him to take off his tie because it's so hot. He does not ever take off his tie. Um, Lots of little things like that. All the characters I've enjoyed so far,
Yeah.
but yeah, we definitely need to shout out Andre Brower here
Yeah.
and just fantastic work. You know,
And shout out to Daniel Baldwin too, and an underappreciated Baldwin brother.
yeah, as
Lost,
one of the
lost in
lesser
time. Yeah.
Baldwins. I'm not sure what all Baldwin's kind of. I did wonder. I'll mention this briefly. I wasn't sure if I would, as it turned out. I put it in our notes. I don't know if you recognize the patrol officer named Chris like I did.
Ooh, I can't say I picked up on it.
That's fine. It was one of those things where it's like, where did I know that guy from? You know? And I really wasn't sure where I knew that guy from. And he's been in a whole bunch of stuff over the years. The
Yeah.
actor's name's Lee Turgeson, and he's usually not a main character, with one exception, one big notable exception in my mind, which is the HBO series Oz.
Okay. Okay. That's right. That's right. I've not seen Oz, but we did reference that not long ago. Yeah.
That show is a hard watch.
Yeah. That's what I've heard.
I mean, it's good, but it's kind of tough to get there. People don't know Oz is all. It's based in prison, and I think it's intentionally,
Yeah.
you know, hard, difficult, dark.
Yeah.
Predates The Sopranos. It's one of these shows that
Yes.
they're had on in the mid 90s. So anyway, that's where I recognized it from. And I go, oh no, they're making me think about Oz.
Well,
Um,
let's also make sure before we close, we talk about this episode 3
yeah,
situation. If you pull up your Peacock and even apparently if you buy the DVDs or however you choose to watch this show now, you will see the episodes in the order that the creators, writers of this show intended for it to be. However, episode 3, which I believe is called Night of the Dead Living, um, was back in 1993 removed from the third episode spot and stuck at the end of the season, which
yeah.
makes it completely out of order, out of timeline, out of chronology, because the executives at NBC and all their brilliance decided that as they're trying to gain viewers, this was not exciting enough, right? This is a bottle episode where they're stuck in the police station. It's too hot. They're talking about the cases, they're talking about their personal lives, but nothing really happens. And
Yeah.
so in 1993, it's moved to the end. You have more stuff about the cases and what became the aired episode 3. Now it's in the right order when you go and watch it on your streaming device.
Right. And apparently, this is not the only time this happens in this series. And there are other instances further down the line that are maybe even more significant.
Okay.
But episode 3, this is why, has a title card at the beginning that's like one hot night in September or
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
because they shoved it to the end of the season. And this is episode 3 is, in the classical sense of the term, a bottle episode.
Right.
You never leave the precinct.
Right.
You're using existing sets, existing cast, and this is often done for budgetary reasons and so on and so forth. Um, I have some more to say about the scheduling thing, but in the middle here, almost, I feel like I should ask, how did you like episode three?
I actually enjoy these types of episodes. I think if they had fed it to us with it at the end, I'd have been completely
It would make
confused
no
and
sense whatsoever. I
what's
agree.
going on
I
here.
absolutely agree.
But I don't mind this sort of level of, to use your word, characterization and depth into who we are, who we're dealing with. And there's some discussion about the cases that are ongoing, but really to find out who these people are as we're just getting started with it. I haven't minded at all.
I maybe did a little bit. I'm not saying it was bad,
Yeah.
but the fact that I think it was about 10 minutes into the episode, I went, oh, this is a bottle episode.
Yeah.
We are never leaving the hot precinct. And I just was clear, and for the fact that I thought that maybe hugged me up a little bit
Yeah.
in realizing what they were doing. And then um there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of banter, and for some reason in this episode in particular, it was kind of striking me, or some of it was striking me as almost kind of too clever by
Yeah.
half.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to really push the writing staff to you're gonna, yeah, just sit them inside an open room for 45 straight minutes and talk about things.
Yeah. But at the same time, maybe what I'm saying isn't fair because this is 1993
Right.
and maybe there, is more novelty to some of this, choppy, witty dialogue
Yep.
that they're doing in this episode in 1993, whereas I'm sitting here in 2024 and it feels like this has been overdone by Aaron Sorkin and Josh Whedon and all these people who are
Yes.
really like
Yeah.
coming later in terms of just having a little bit of that feeling like people in real life aren't this witty all the time. Not all the time, just
Yeah.
there was a
Yeah.
little bit of that, a little bit of that. Um, but not a major complaint.
Yeah.
But I guess I wanted to hit on that but first because there is a degree in which it makes sense to me that from the point of view of the TV executives, they thought this episode's too boring.
Yeah.
Like this is episode three. It's too boring. And we were talking about this a little bit last night, and as I told you, I did put something on Blue Sky. I asked Alan Sepinwall. He responded today,
Oh, good.
uh,
Okay.
for what it's worth, and not a ton more detail than we already have, but I did think it was interesting. Alan Sepinwall said that maybe every time they did this, because there are further instances in the future, it was because of sweeps.
Mm.
They didn't want that episode to be the episode that was airing during sweeps. And I don't even know if they still do sweeps.
Yeah, that's a very 1990s thing to worry about.
Right. I presume you know what I'm talking about, but I don't
Yes,
even know if some of our younger listeners would know what I'm talking about.
absolutely. Yeah.
So
There
for
was a
for
week
the
a week of the year where the measurements and the ratings and the metrics that would all be sort of compiled as to what, who and how many people are watching your show. That would lead towards what type of advertisers you got, what level you could charge for ads, things like that. Yeah. So you put your best stuff during sweeps weeks.
yeah, that's a pretty good brief explanation for the Zoomers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that was part of it. But then he also said in his brief comment that it became something of a running joke amongst his friends, fans of the show,
Yeah.
that every time that they reschedule an episode, it was bound to become an instant classic.
Well, I thought it funny because one person I read sort of discussing what had happened here is that the first season of this show, the ratings were not great from the beginning to the end. They were not great. It won some awards after the season, so it was saved and people thought so highly of it, even though the viewership wasn't there. But that the executives at NBC decided on whether or not they were going to keep the show based on, let's see what the last few episodes, what the viewers look like in those last few. I was like, and then you didn't think this one was good enough to show at the beginning, so you're going to show it at the end, and you're going to measure the show whether or not we keep it based on the number of viewers. I mean, that's some backwards way of thinking that who knows if that would be the case today, but just interesting
No, it
strategy
wouldn't.
there.
I mean, I can't imagine this being the case today. This feels like entirely a relic of 1990s TV executives and how they operate.
Yeah,
And I mean, because if you move this episode to the end of the season, it's not a season finale. It makes no sense as a season finale whatsoever.
not at all.
And it gets to how fundamentally they didn't care, and that kind of integrity of the storyline and what's supposed to fit where and what is the season finale. Um, One has to imagine the TV executives still operating with the view that this is television. The whole point is that every episode stands alone. You don't
Yeah.
have to watch the whole thing. We can put them in any goddamn order we want to. And that's, you're supposed to make it in a way where that works. And we don't think this episode is good enough for sweeps week. So we're just
Yeah.
going to shove it to the end of the season, which I don't know what the date was when it aired or whatever. But they were like, well, we don't care. Not as many people are going to be watching in May. But everything shifted. And I do think that would be in line with some of the shows that we already mentioned.
Yeah.
But maybe you got to give a lot of credit, I think, to The Sopranos, although it was on HBO, insofar as after that, you started to see even the networks
Yes.
try to copy that kind of more serial story. I mean, Lost was on
Right.
ABC.
Exactly. Yeah. You're exactly right. I think it's not a coincidence that this ends in 99, which is around the time that these shows like Sopranos is going, Oz is ongoing at that point. Like I said, Alias starts about this time, Lost comes in 2004. So it definitely walked so these other shows could run.
Yeah, for sure. And again, well, I've already made the point about DVDs, but I think it's an important point.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned with Twin Peaks earlier, I'm a huge fan of Twin Peaks, and there's a huge cult following. But man, you have to see every episode. And if you were trying to watch the show in 1990, 1991, and then they switch what night it airs, and you missed an episode, you're just out of luck,
Yep. Too
you
bad.
know. Um, and that really does start changing with technology moving forward the way it did. So, cool. Anything else you want to hit on here in the first three
I
episodes?
think that's it. Definitely going to push through and finish this first season, and maybe even go beyond that. So we can talk about the next season a week from now if you want, or the rest of the season a
Yeah,
week from if you want
talk
to.
about the rest of season one next week. So we'll see how that goes, and take it from there. And we'll have conversations off air about plans beyond next week, I think. But next week we can finish season one. I want to finish season one. I want to see also like how much closure we get in the first season. There's a question that I have, so that'll be
Yeah,
interesting.
definitely.
And then we'll see whether we go further or shift gears to something else in terms of the podcast. But all right, I hope you all have enjoyed listening. There were hardly even any spoilers in that conversation.
No, not at all.
Someone killed Adina Watts.
Yeah.
You don't find out who. Anyhow, hopefully you all have enjoyed listening to the podcast here, and you'll join us again next week. Please do to leave a good rating, review, listen, listening on YouTube. Hit that thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'd appreciate it. Check out tvobsessive.com. No articles there on homicide life on the streets as of yet. There are some articles on the wire
Yep.
for what it's worth. Follow the site on social media. Look for TV Obsessive. And we'll see you next week.
All right. Looking forward to it. See you next time.